how do we really know what we know? Like when we say we know something, is that really a solid fact? Or is it more like a kind of a shared belief that we've all agreed on?
Yeah, it's a fundamental question, and it's the kind of question that has plagued philosophers for centuries,
Right.
right? And today we're going to take a look at a thinker who offers a really, really unique perspective on these sorts of questions of knowledge, of truth, of reality.
And this is someone who's coming at it not just from the armchair philosopher's perspective, right? This is a guy who's really been in the thick of things.
Exactly. I mean, we were talking about Ludwik Fleck. He was a Polish Jewish microbiologist working back in the 1930s. And what makes him so interesting, especially for you, as a philosopher, is that his insights into knowledge and how it works, they didn't just come from like abstract thinking, you know. He was a scientist, right? Like he was dealing with the nitty-gritty of how we come to know things.
And not just in a cushy lab setting, right?
No, not at all. I mean, this is a guy who was working in incredibly difficult circumstances. He actually contributed to developing an anti-typhus vaccine while he was in a concentration camp. So he had this like really grounded, almost visceral understanding of how knowledge is formed.
Wow. That's just, it adds a whole other layer to thinking about his work, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think for you listening, if you're someone who really digs into questions about epistemology, about the nature of truth and how the context, the social and historical context shapes what we think we know, Fleck's work is really going to offer some like mind-blowing like aha moments, because he goes deep into how these social structures that we're all part of actually shape our understanding of the most basic things.
All right, so let's dive in. What are some of these key ideas that we're going to be looking at in this deep dive?
So the heart of Fleck's thinking, the things we're going to be focusing on, are his concepts of thought collectives, thought styles, and how those things influence, like really shape how we see reality, how we see truth. And these ideas, I mean, they're right at the core of philosophical inquiry into how we know anything at all, really.
Okay, so let's start with that first big idea, thought collectives. What exactly is Fleck getting at with this idea?
Right. So Fleck's central argument, and this is a big one, especially for folks who come from a more individualistic perspective on thinking and knowing, is that knowledge, knowing something, it's not just this solo thing, right? It's not happening in isolation in your own head. He says it's fundamentally a collective activity.
Okay, so walk me through this. How does that work?
So imagine a group of people, right? And they're engaged in this constant exchange of ideas. They're talking to each other, they're debating, they're sharing their thoughts, they're interacting intellectually in a sustained way. This is what Fleck called a thought collective.
So it's more than just like a random group of people who happen to be, chatting about something.
Right. It's more than just a casual gathering. There's a kind of shared, what he called a mood, a kind of intellectual solidarity. Like a sense of purpose that binds them together. And it's within these thought collectives, these communities of thinkers, that knowledge really takes shape.
So give me a few examples here. What kind of groups would we be thinking about?
I mean, the easiest one to grasp, I think, is a scientific community, right? Like think of physicists working on a particular problem, or a group of biologists studying a certain phenomenon. But it's broader than that. You can think of religious movements as thought collectives, where there's a shared set of beliefs and practices.
Oh, okay. And even like artistic movements, right? Like the Impressionists or the Surrealists. Exactly.
Any group where people are coming together around a set of shared ideas, a shared way of looking at the world, and they're engaged in this ongoing dialogue. That's what Fleck would call a thought collective.
Okay. So, and as a philosopher, I mean, you could even think about different schools of thought within philosophy as thought collectives, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like think about the existentialists or the pragmatists. Each of them with their own key thinkers, their own set of assumptions, their own ways of approaching philosophical problems.
So we've got these thought collectives, these groups of people, bouncing ideas off of each other, debating, arguing sometimes. So what happens next? How does this kind of collective activity actually, lead to knowledge?
So that's where the concept of thought style comes in. So through this constant back and forth, through this sharing of ideas, but also through, misunderstandings, through kind of working through things together, what emerges is a thought style. And this is like the collective's, fingerprint, their unique way of seeing the world, of thinking about things, of responding to problems and questions.
So it's like a shared lens, that they're all looking through.
That's a great way to put it. And Fleck emphasized that these thought styles, they're not just abstract, sets of beliefs floating around. They actually have a real impact on how members of that collective perceive reality itself.
Okay, now that's getting pretty trippy. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So Fleck talked about how these thought styles, they have both what he called active elements and passive elements. The active elements are like the shared assumptions, the methods, the ways of approaching things that the group has developed. These are like the things that actively shape their understanding.
And the passive elements.
The passive elements are what the collective ends up perceiving as objective reality. It's like they've put on these glasses, these thought style glasses, and they're seeing the world through that lens. And they often don't even realize they're wearing the glasses,
That's a pretty huge idea. It's kind of challenging that whole notion of objectivity that we tend to take for granted.
It is a radical notion.
Yeah.
And it really has implications for philosophy, for how we think about the relationship between our minds and the world out there.
Oh, yeah.
It suggests that maybe what we perceive as objective reality isn't quite as independent of us as we might like to think.
Okay, so we've got these thought collectives, these groups with their shared thought styles, and they're kind of shaping how they see reality. Where do things go from there?
Well, as a thought style develops, as it becomes more sophisticated, more specialized, Fleck observed this pattern where the thought collective often kind of divides into what he called an esoteric circle and an exoteric circle.
Ooh, fancy terms. Break those down for me.
Right. So the esoteric circle, that's like the inner circle, the real experts, the specialists within that thought style. Think about like the leading scientists in a particular field or maybe, the most influential philosophers within a particular school of thought. They're the ones who are really shaping and refining the core ideas of that thought style.
And the exoteric circle is?
The exoteric circle is everyone else who's influenced by that thought style, but they're not actively involved in creating it or developing it. Think about the scientifically literate public,
Yeah.
Who accept the findings of science, but they're not doing the research themselves.
Or you could even think about students of philosophy who are learning about, a particular school of thought, but they haven't necessarily contributed anything new to it yet.
Exactly. And there's this dynamic between these two circles, where the esoteric circle is kind of seen as the authority, and the exoteric circle is learning from them. But it's not a one-way street. The esoteric circle is also influenced by the broader cultural context, by what the exoteric circle kind of expects or demands.
So it's like a two-way street, there's this feedback loop happening.
Exactly. And that's really important for how a thought style maintains itself and how it changes over time.
Okay, so now we get to, I think, one of the most radical, the most challenging ideas in Fleck's work, at least for folks who are coming from a more traditional philosophical perspective. And that's his idea that facts, the things that we take to be true about the world, they're not just out there waiting for us to discover them. He says they're social constructs.
Yeah, he famously said that only what is true to culture is true to nature. And that's a pretty big statement,
Yeah.
right? Especially for philosophers who are often searching for objective truth, for things that are true, regardless of what we happen to believe.
So what's he saying here? Is he saying that there's no reality outside of our minds?
No, he's not saying that there's no reality, but he's saying that the way we access that reality, the way we understand it, the way we even perceive it, is always shaped by the thought collective that we're a part of, by the thought style that we've internalized.
So it's like our thought styles are kind of like filters, they're shaping what we notice, what we pay attention to.
That's a good analogy. And it leads us to this other really important concept that Fleck talks about, and that's incommensurability. And this idea really took off later on with Thomas Kuhn and his work on scientific paradigms.
Okay, incommensurability. That sounds pretty complicated. What's that all about?
So what Fleck's saying is that different thought styles, different thought collectives, they can be so different in their ways of seeing the world that they're essentially incommensurable. It's like they're speaking different languages.
Yeah.
What counts as a fact, what counts as a problem, what counts as a solution in one thought style might not even make sense in another.
Okay, so it's more than just, having different opinions about the same thing. It's like they're operating on different planes of reality almost.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, to really make it concrete, Fleck uses this example of scientists, bringing a layperson into a laboratory.
Okay, I'm picturing this. So you've got this layperson who's, never been in a lab before. They don't have any scientific training. And they walk into this lab, and what do they see?
They might see, a bunch of complicated equipment that they don't understand. They might hear jargon, terminology that they've never heard before. They might focus on things that to a scientist are completely irrelevant. Like they might notice a weird smell or a flashing light, but they're not going to see what a scientist sees.
Okay, so then a scientist walks into the same lab. What do they see?
The scientists, because they're steeped in that thought style, they've been trained in that way of thinking, they're immediately going to recognize the important pieces of equipment. They're going to understand the purpose of the experiments that are being done. They're going to focus on the data points that are relevant.
So it's like their training, their immersion in that thought collective has actually changed what they're able to see, what they're able to even perceive.
That's exactly it. And Fleck put it really well. He said, to see means to recreate at a suitable moment a picture created by the mental collective to which one belongs. So it's like we're actively constructing our reality, in a way based on the thought style that we're operating within.
Oh, that's pretty mind-blowing. Now, thinking about all this, where do new scientific facts come from? Or you could even think about, new philosophical ideas. How do those emerge within this framework?
So Fleck talks about how new research, new ideas, they often start with what he called proto-ideas. And these are kind of like vague initial concepts. They're not fully formed yet. They might come from all sorts of places. They might come from religious beliefs. They might come from philosophical speculation. They might come from, just kind of random observations.
So they're kind of like seeds, that haven't fully sprouted yet.
Exactly. And then through this process of collective research, through experimentation, through debate, through sometimes even misunderstandings, these proto-ideas get refined, they get tested, they get shaped by the thought style of the collective.
And the final product, the fact or the idea that emerges, it's not always what they set out to find.
Right. Fleck emphasized that the final fact or the established idea, it often comes about in unexpected ways. It's not necessarily the original idea that they had. It's been transformed through this collective process.
So it's almost like the thought collective itself is kind of like an organism, that's evolving and changing over time.
That's a great way to think about it. And once a particular thought style really takes hold within a collective, it becomes so ingrained that the members often don't even realize how much it's influencing them. It's just how they see the world.
It's like the water they swim in, they don't even notice it anymore.
Exactly. And the language that they use, the instruments that they develop, all of that reinforces the thought style, and it makes it really, really difficult to even imagine, alternative ways of thinking.
And you see that in philosophy too, right? I mean, think about the different specialized vocabularies that different schools of philosophy use, or the different ways that they approach problems.
Absolutely. And that can make it really hard to have a conversation across those different schools of thought, because they're operating with these different assumptions, these different ways of seeing the world.
Okay, so if Fleck is saying that truth is not this, objective thing out there, that we're just trying to discover, then how does he define truth?
So for Fleck, truth is what he called intracollective. It's determined within a specific thought style. So if something is true, if it fits within the established body of knowledge of that thought collective, if it's accepted as valid by the members of that group.
So it's kind of like a consensus reality in a way.
That's a good way to put it. And he was very clear that this doesn't mean that truth is just subjective. that it's just whatever anyone wants it to be. It's tied to this shared understanding of a particular thought collective.
So it's more nuanced than just saying, truth is relative or truth is subjective.
Right. He's saying that truth is social, it's historically situated, but it's not just arbitrary.
It's fascinating how Flick was already talking about these ideas, back in the 1930s. And you mentioned earlier that his work didn't, immediately become super famous, but that it had this kind of delayed impact, especially through Thomas Kuhn.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. Fleck's book, it got some good reviews when it first came out, but it didn't really, make a huge splash. And it was really Thomas Kuhn who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, one of the most influential books in the philosophy of science. It was Kuhn who kind of rediscovered Fleck and acknowledged him as a major influence.
So Fleck was kind of ahead of his time.
I think that's fair to say. And even after Kuhn's book came out, Fleck's work was still, it was still kind of in the shadows for a while. But in recent years, there's been this real resurgence of interest in his work, and people are starting to see how truly groundbreaking it was.
So for our listener, for the philosopher who's tuned in to this deep dive, what's the big takeaway here? What should they be thinking about after listening to this?
I think the core message of Fleck's work is that we need to be really, really careful about assuming that our knowledge, our understanding of reality, that it's just this neutral, objective thing. He's showing us that the way we know the world is deeply, deeply shaped by the social and historical context that we're a part of.
And as philosophers, that's something we really need to wrestle with, right? It challenges a lot of the traditional assumptions about how we do philosophy.
Absolutely, and it also raises this really fascinating question. If our knowledge is so shaped by our thought collectives,
Yeah.
then how can we ever really bridge those gaps between different ways of understanding the world? What does that mean for the search for universal truths?
Yeah, that's a really profound question to leave us with, and I think it's one that Fleck's work really pushes us to grapple with. And if this deep dive has got you really curious, I would highly recommend checking out Fleck's book Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact. It's a challenging read, but it's really, really rewarding.
I completely agree. And there's also a lot of great, secondary literature that's been written about Fleck, in recent years that can really help to unpack some of these complex ideas.
So there's plenty out there to explore. But for now, we'll leave you with that big question to ponder.
And hopefully it'll spark some interesting thoughts, some interesting conversations.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.